Okay, and just before I hand things over to Christi, a reminder, we've done a handful of reconstructed parenting sessions. You can find some of the material on our Instagram page, which will be at Restore SBY, also our YouTube channel. Tessa, if you have a computer nearby, could you throw some of those links in the chat at some point? And if you don't, I guess you do because you're on your computer. Thanks. That's good. That's good. Smart. We've talked to some therapists. We've talked to a content expert where it comes to children's literature, specifically around the ideas of racism and diversifying our libraries for our kids. We have plans to talk to some other folks as well. So we've been trying to make content available that will be both helpful and interesting. But the focus is for parents that have maybe rethought some of their theology over the last few years and find themselves at a weird space, needing some new resources for old and familiar conversations where we've taken a different turn than maybe what we got when we were growing up. So that's the MO here. And tonight we have Christi Engle, who will tell us a little bit about her story with regard to the Enneagram and some of her training, but she is the Restoration Project's in-house Enneagram guru, and we appreciate her for her knowledge. And she's going to try to bring some of the awareness around the Enneagram to bear on our parenting. As Tessa mentioned in the promotional stuff, this isn't necessarily just for parents. Anytime you talk about the Enneagram and self-awareness, there's things that can be learned and benefits that can be had when you consider relationships and how people engage with one another, just knowing who you are and maybe having an understanding of who some other people are as well. So, Christi, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you and let you get to it. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to what you got for us.
Yeah, I appreciate that recap of the initiatives the Restoration Project has taken on regarding parenting and deconstructing and other things. It's super exciting and good work, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of it tonight. I want to welcome everyone who popped on. As some of you shared, this is a challenging time with bedtime. Some of your kids are still up, and I really appreciate your time and participation and involvement tonight. It means a lot to me that you're here. Our topic tonight is the Enneagram and parenting, and how personality development and the Enneagram can be a resource in your own parenting journey. So I'd like to start, for those of you who don't know me well, with a brief introduction. I'm Christi. I've been married for 25 years next month to Josh, which is not Josh James, another Josh, which is crazy to say, 25 years, but here we are. We have 2 kids in college. I have a senior graduating next month and a sophomore, Luke and Nathan, and they're super fun. Professionally, I have a bachelor's degree in biblical counseling, and I've made the study of counseling and personal growth and understanding personality development and psychology my life's work. So I've had a little bit of formal training, and I've done a lot of informal training in those 25 years post-college. 5 years ago, I encountered the Enneagram, and I found it personally transformative, life-changing, as I learned my own type and its motivations and characteristics, and as my loved ones and friends and some of my core people learned theirs. And now we have common language from which to discuss our experiences and process things going on, and that's been super insightful. And this has led me to begin the process of certification to teach the Enneagram, which will be complete within about a month's time. I'm almost finished with those requirements for completion. I'm super excited to bring what I've learned to others who are interested in personal growth and self-discovery. I grew up in Pennsylvania. Some of you know that, the third of 4 kids. And as a child, my personality could be described as compliant, not one to rock the boat, timid, sensitive, And when Josh and I became parents, we dutifully embarked on a parenting classes when our firstborn was 6 weeks old. And we completed a course called Growing Kids God's Way, which informed many of our early parenting choices. We were sort of intentional to do things a little different than our parents had done. And so that was kind of our entryway into our own journey for parenting. And one of my earliest and most enduring parenting mistakes was believing that there was, in fact, one God's way, and that if I just did my part and put in the work, and I sure was willing, then I could expect a certain outcome. And this, of course, if you've been parenting for more than 20 minutes, you know this, it doesn't take into consideration the fact that our children are real people with their own wills and choices, and that they grow up and they learn how to do it their way too. And that over the years, it didn't take into consideration that my own view of what was the most high priority would change. But nevertheless, this is how we began. And we'll circle back to touch on that approach a little bit later in our time tonight. So I'm not sure where you all are in your knowledge or introduction to the Enneagram. If you happen to know your own type, feel free to type it into the chat box and share with the group if you would like. I resonate most closely with the type 6 on the Enneagram. If you're not familiar, that may not mean anything to you at this moment, but we'll talk a little bit more in depth about the types in just a bit. And for now, I just want to start with a brief introduction about the Enneagram and an overview, and that'll kick us off. So, I love seeing your types in the chat box. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing, you guys. No problem, Sarah. Take your time. So the Enneagram in its earliest forms was an ancient tool. It was used in the context of spiritual direction for centuries and has been taught from spiritual guide to student, handed down from one person to the next. And it was modernized to its current form in the early 20th century. By the mid 1960s and 70s, it was being taught in Berkeley, California. And from there, it began to be published in book form, cassette tape form, and was distributed and became more widely known. So it's essentially a personality typing system that teaches that there are 9 basic styles in the world that show up consistently in the human personality. And one of the reasons I love the Enneagram is because it's not simply a labeling system. It's a map that outlines patterns of growth for each of the personality styles. So child development experts tell us that every child begins to adapt from its earliest stages, even beginning in utero, to the world around them. As infants, our first priority is getting basic needs met: food and water, shelter, and love and belonging. If you think of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like we start at the bottom, and that's where we are in infancy. And as we grow and develop, we react to the world around us and adopt strategies to help us cope with our experiences and ultimately help us ensure our survival. So the Enneagram teaches that there are 9 basic strategies that we engage with to help protect ourselves, navigate relationships, get our needs met. And it highlights not just behaviors, although we will talk about some behaviors, but significantly, it points out why we do what we do, revealing our unconscious motivations. These motivations strongly influence everything we do, how we feel, how we think, and how we manage times of stress and security with really incredible accuracy based on human characteristics and patterns. So many people ask, why only 9? Surely the human personality can't be reduced to 9 types. And that's a fair question. It's a good one. But I like to point people to think about it like the colors on a color wheel, and the infinite shades and hues represented within those finite number of colors that you see on the color wheel. So we're not just suggesting that there are 9 types of people. That's silly. There are an infinite number of variations of how people express themselves within the 9 main personality profiles. And in fact, the Enneagram really helps us to learn and appreciate the differences in human personality and how our types show up for us uniquely. The method that I was trained in is called the narrative tradition. And one of the things we do is we ask people how they experience their type. And we actually base our teachings around the feedback that we're getting from people. So it really does pull out individual perspectives. We're going to be moving into how the Enneagram would show up for children in just a little bit. I want to let you guys know that I'm aiming to have us wrapped up no later than 8:30 for your planning purposes. But before we close for the night, I'm going to create some space for a question and response time. And so if you guys have anything, write down your questions as we go. We'll take those at the end. But before we get to that, I want to address a couple of frequently asked questions, and then we'll jump into talking about 9 types in childhood. Tessa or Josh, if there's anything in the chat that I need to be aware of, bring it to my attention. Otherwise, I'll check that at the end. So one question frequently raised is, do our types change throughout our lifetime? And the short answer is they do not. Although things like family dynamics and peer influences, stress, trauma, and then our eventual maturity can play a part in the expression of our basic personality, the basic motivations of our type do not change. We may look like other types at times. That would fall into like Enneagram 2.0 teachings, and we won't have time to get to that tonight for the reasons of that. But our core type remains the same throughout our lifetime. Next question I thought I'd bring up is, where does our Enneagram type come from? Is it nature or nurture? This is a question I hear brought up in almost every group I'm in where the Enneagram is being taught. It's a hot topic in the Enneagram world, and people actually have differing views on this. But most of the sources that I've heard on this subject maintain that our Enneagram type is largely nature, meaning we're born with it. And our subtypes, which is, again, a topic we won't get into tonight, but that those seem to be more influenced by our family unit or created by nurture. So I would concur with this idea based on my own experience, observations, and study as well. Enneagram is nature. We're born with that number, and then we filter our experiences through that lens. And then a third question is, what's the best way to type myself for my kids? We're going to come back to that a little bit later in the evening, so hold on to that question if it was one of yours. I'll be addressing both of those in a bit. So as we get into talking about the different Enneagram types and how they look in children, I'm following author Elizabeth Weigel's example here, and I'm going to refer to the certain traits exhibited by children as styles rather than types. We typically call them Enneagram types, but for kids, because we can't yet type them. So this honors the fact that type isn't going to be evident in little kids. And it's not verifiable until they reach adulthood and they do their own inner work and decide what their type is and then tell us. So for the sake of consistency, I'm going to use styles when I'm talking about the kids. And I'll also be using most of her titles. I did adapt a couple of them because I liked a different term better. But most of her titles I'm using for each of the styles as well as we unpack each one. So here's how I'm going to be talking about the styles. I'm not going to start with 1 and end with 9. So the Enneagram is divided into 3 triads, and we're going to explore the styles and types in the context of these triads. So the first triad that we're going to be talking about contains types 8, 9, and 1 on the Enneagram. This is the body or gut center, and these types typically have issues around anger. Types 8, 9, and 1. So the first one we're going to talk about is the challenger style. This correlates with type 8. So these children tend to have a great deal of energy and strength. And I don't mean physical strength, I mean personality strength, kind of a big personality in the room. They show their anger and dissatisfaction rather freely, and they may speak or act impulsively from the gut. They may display a need. This is something you might recognize in these kids, a need to go against an authority or maybe another child who's acting in charge, because they definitely do not like to be controlled. And their primary motivation centers around proving their strength, asserting themselves, and avoiding weakness and vulnerability. These kids also have a way of looking out for their friends and other loved ones, and they may stick up for and defend an underdog. They have a really soft underbelly, like a sensitive and vulnerable side. One person I heard describe them as a tank full of marshmallows. And that side may come out at times when they feel safe and secure. You may see that softer side. So parenting these kids is going to mean helping them harness their big energy, helping them manage their anger, and fostering their fierce independence, and then helping them to channel their assertive energy as a source of good for others. And that's not a leap for them. I mean, they can certainly be impulsive with their actions, but they will be a voice for the voiceless too. So helping them to channel that energy to those directions will be helpful for them. And then help them to engage in moderation and sensitivity and learn the value of a sincere and felt apology. And then helping these kids in times of vulnerability, like affirming vulnerability, because this leads them back to their true selves. So the next style we're going to be talking about correlates with type 9 on the Enneagram. This is the peacemaker style. And these kids are typically super easygoing. They don't like to rock the boat. They go with the flow. They go along to get along. And they may have trouble making decisions for themselves and defer to other people's choices. They may bring harmony. They often bring harmony to the environment. And you may see them loving the outdoors, connecting with nature. And they may also have a stubborn streak, like where they dig their heels in because they don't want to clean up, so they'll go extra slow, but they're not going to tell you they don't want to clean up. Like you'll see it kind of coming out sideways a bit if they don't want to do something. They really don't like conflict, and they typically avoid it at all costs. And they may be tuned out from or unaware of their own anger, although it is there under the surface. Sometimes their anger will show up in explosion of expression because it's been ignored for too long. With peacemakers, they're motivated by a need to avoid conflict and maintain an inner peace and a relational peace with others. So parenting these kids effectively will involve reminding them of their own worth and value to the family, and intentionally making them feel seen and important, because this style will often grow up believing that their presence doesn't really matter. So they need to hear the corresponding message that their presence does, in fact, matter to me, to this family, and to the world. So especially in the face of bigger or more assertive personalities, like especially among their siblings, go out of your way to make sure their opinion is heard and let them know it's needed and valued. And allow them a safe place to express their anger when appropriate, knowing that if they're able to express it in a productive way, that's a really big step for them. And the third style in this triad, the gut or body triad, is the perfectionistic style. This correlates with type 1 on the Enneagram. So these kids are typically super conscientious, well-mannered. They're known for doing the right thing at school and at home. Teachers love them because they know they can count on them. Their homework's going to be in on time. So you'll get really good comments on them at home. They may be really hard on themselves, sometimes excessively so, as their inner critic becomes to get developed. And as they get older, you're going to see more of that. And they can also be hard on others when they see lapses in what they consider right behavior. They're concerned with doing the right thing, making what they see as wrong things right, and also avoiding fault or blame. They know the rules and they're going to follow them to the letter. And they actually get angry. This is when their anger comes up when others don't. Motivationally, these kids are concerned with doing the right thing and striving for improvement of themselves, others, and the world. Also justifying themselves and the reasons why they're doing what they're doing. And again, they want to avoid criticism, fault, or blame, which they're extra sensitive to. So parenting these kids may mean helping them realize that mistakes are a part of learning and growing. We all experience them. Also, it's really important to correct them in private rather than in front of others because of that harshly inner critical voice, and they're highly sensitive. So especially don't correct them in front of siblings would be a big deal, or peers, and helping them deal with their anger or resentment. Be intentional and persistent with the message that they can be imperfect and loved at the same time. That's a message they need to hear throughout their lifetime. And model being okay with their effort over the results. So think report cards or sports game scores here, that they measure success in other ways other than that they did it perfectly. And find alternate ways to measure their success. So for example, good questions might be, were you a good teammate? Did you give your best effort even when it got hard? Can you tell me where things went right tonight, instead of their normal focus of attention, which will go to what went wrong? And this is how you can support kids who have that perfectionistic style early on. So moving to the next triad, these are going to be containing types 2, 3, and 4 on the Enneagram, and we're now in the heart or feeling center. These types typically have issues with image and shame. So the first one, correlating with type 2 on the Enneagram, is the helper style. These kids typically show up in the world as relational, sensitive, sociable, and attuned to other people's needs and wants. They may get their feelings hurt easily, and they want to be helpful and pleasing to others. And they're going to start to develop into the people pleasers that some of us know. So they may get deep in their feelings when they're upset, and they can feel angry when their displays of friendship aren't returned or noticed. They kind of will develop the idea that I have to give to get love. They're motivated by a need to be helpful and present in the lives of others in order to win love or approval. And that's key. When they get older and they grow up, these people aren't going out into the world saying, who can I help? They're going out into the world saying, how can I get love? Oh, I'll help this person and then they'll love me. And that's kind of how that develops. So over time, this style can lead to a prideful disposition, as they come to believe that they can know or intuit what other people's needs and help to meet those desires, while at the same time, they're not in tune to their own needs, so they deny or suppress their own. Parenting these kids will include helping them name and own their own feelings, give them language for that, helping them to focus on themselves rather than worrying about everybody else and what they may need, working on healthy boundary development, which doesn't come naturally to them, and expanding their ability and comfortability spending time alone. Also, helping them to understand that they don't have to earn love and approval. They are loved for who they are and not for what they do. That's a really healing message for our little helpers. The next type on the Enneagram that we're looking at is the achiever style. So this is type 3 on the Enneagram. As children, little achievers can be little performers who do well socially, have many abilities and interests, and display a quick and efficient ability to complete tasks, and may be quite competitive. They tend to bask in other people's pride, and they want to be the best, and they really have a hard time with failure. They take it hard when they experience failure. So they have a knack for noticing what brings them kudos, and then they have a way of shape-shifting to become successful in that image. So they're trying to give you what you want. And sadly, over time, that means they leave an essential part of their true nature behind as they accumulate all these masks that they're putting on for other people for the sake of those kudos and getting being seen and known for their successes. Over time, you may notice that these kids don't have much time for feelings. Feelings are messy and they get in the way of what they're trying to achieve. They may jump to the finish line for even sidestepping some things or not getting every step perfect, because it's super important to get to the end, to get to the goal and check the to-do list off. So the core motivation for kids with the achiever style is to appear to be, but actually also be successful. to be admired and esteemed, and to avoid failure at all costs. Although they're in the feeling triad, they're actually not tuned into their feelings, and this can be a blind spot that they're out of touch with because of their over focus on performance and success. They're often like, what feelings? No, I'm fine. I'm just doing the next thing. And because they come to believe that they're loved for their achievements, parenting these little ones effectively would include helping them to know their value outside of the wins. So be aware of your own speech and focus around competition and winning. Help them to slow down and to just be without performing. And challenge the cultural definitions around success, and then purposely re-identify those for your own family. Don't allow them to make everything a competition, and help them team with others to help other people be successful too. That's an important focus for them, is to widen their scope around success. Help them to name and identify their own feelings and goals without conforming to the ideal set by someone else. That's just helping them find their own voice. So the last one in our heart feeling triad is the individualist style. This correlates with type 4. And these children have a flair for the dramatic, and they value expression. And this can show up as self-expression in dress. Possibly you can sometimes see them coming because of a purple hair color or the way that they're expressing themselves in their outfits. Expression of feelings and expression in various forms of arts. They have a way of seeing the world in uniquely creative ways, and they really often love imagery, poetry, or creative representation. They spend a lot of time in the world of feelings, and their feelings can range from big highs and big lows, and more often throughout the day than other people are in their feelings. So they tend to feel different and lonely and misunderstood. And motivationally, they want to be seen as special and unique, because ultimately individualists believe there's like a fatal flaw that they have, a kind of a missing piece, something that they lack but everybody else has. Individualists can be tiring to people with different personalities than them, which makes them further feel alienated if this message becomes clear to them. It can lead to a sense of abandonment, which is a common theme for these people, and it further perpetuates by developing into like a push-pull style of relating, like leaning in and then pulling away from relationship. So parents can counter these early wounding messages by learning to, we can take a page from Ian Cron. He's an Enneagram author who he himself is this type on the Enneagram. He suggests that you detach without withdrawing. So this involves listening without necessarily agreeing or getting sucked into the emotional windstorm. But he suggests do not try to change their reality. The key here is to not leave them when they're in this space. It just serves to perpetuate those feelings of abandonment, but acknowledge their feelings and help them to look at the positive and negative side of things, maybe balance their view a little bit, and encourage them to avoid envy and comparison by helping them to focus on what's present, what's available, and what's good, rather than on what's missing. Additionally, this is my note, encourage their unique self-expressions. They're giving a piece of themselves to the world in their art, in their creativity, or in their style. So just appreciate and value their sweet offerings. So moving into the final triad represented on the Enneagram in types 5, 6, and 7, we're here now in the head and mind center. And these types typically have issues with fear. Type 5 on the Enneagram is going to correlate with the observer style in children. As kids, these kids like to be left alone. They may be introverted and display a keen intelligence, and they really value their independence. They tend to stay on the edges of a group rather than to be right in the middle of things. And they often don't conform to social norms. So they're not going to be the kid who wants what every other kid has necessarily. They may be uncomfortable with direct attention or public praise, and they often display like a niche interest or a really witty and side sense of humor. My son is this type, and he's really witty, but he doesn't need anybody out. Like, he'll like super quietly to the side say something super funny, and if I can catch it, like, we have a moment. But if I don't catch it, he's fine. He does not need anybody. He enjoys himself. He does not need one other person to be in that with him, but he's super fun to observe on this because he's like the fiviest of the fives. So observers are just as they described. They observe with curious and active minds, which is where they spend a lot of their time. So these people can be in the room with you, but not in the room with you because they're up in their heads and imagining all kinds of things. And but they're listening even when they don't appear to be paying attention. And then oftentimes later, they'll come back and ask you something you had no idea they were paying attention to. They're highly perceptive, sensitive, and intuitive. They value alone time. And if you show up to their alone time unannounced, that feels highly intrusive to them. So that's something that's really important to know. We've had to adjust how we like show up to our kid's bedroom. Like, I've asked him, he's 21 now, so he's not a little guy, but I said, would you prefer if I text before we just show up? Or would you prefer if I knock on the door? Or how do you want me to approach you in that moment? Because it feels intrusive if he doesn't know we're coming and we show up. Oftentimes you'll notice that they have a little place in the house that they want to be just theirs. Could be their bedroom, or it could be a little nook away. It's kind of like their castle where they spend a lot of time. And they're motivated by a need to be competent, to know and perceive, and to avoid being depleted by others or by social demands. I think it's really important to know about this type that they start off with a lower meter for how much people time they can have than the rest of us. So like if we wake up and our battery's charged at 100%, they may wake up with a battery charged at like 70%. So they're done with people earlier than some of us who are more sociable. These children are also cut off more from their feelings than others with different styles. They often process their feelings later, even days later, and may circle back to ask questions after the fact. So parenting them will mean engaging their interests and getting into their world a little bit, that niche world. This really means a lot to them and expresses love. Give them plenty of alone time, corralling their siblings when needed to allow them space by themselves and honor their space. Don't force social situations on them, and don't be distressed if their preference is different from yours. They're really just trying to figure things out. So be a consistent, engaged presence in your relationship, and that will be offering them like a steady rock that they can count on. And as a fear-based style, that will also offer great comfort. So the next one is the questioner style. This is going to correlate with type 6 on the Enneagram. And these kids may worry more. They often question authority more. And I don't mean question authority as in challenge authority necessarily. They really are trying to figure out if they can trust authority. Then once they know if they can or can't trust authority, they will react differently depending on what the answer to that question is. But they are concerned with questions of authority. They want to know who's in charge and what the dynamic is and what they can expect from that person. And this style often is the one that will typically display that fight or flight mechanism that we hear about in response to fear. So the more phobic kids of this style will become more compliant, obedient, and conformist. And the counterphobics will rebel against authorities that haven't garnered their trust or have lost their trust. And they may also face their fears head on with power. So it doesn't look like a fear-based style when they're in that place. These kids feel that they can't trust the environment, at least not initially, not until they get the lay of the land, and they have trouble then essentially trusting themselves. So when they find a teacher, a friend, a group, or authority who they deem trustworthy, which just takes time and experience, then they're intensely loyal to that person or that group. Their core motivation is to have safety and security, to feel supported by others, and to test the motives and the attitudes of those around them, and then also to avoid anxiety and insecurity. So parenting these kids effectively means offering a safe place for them to process their anxieties while also speaking truth to the situation and helping them see when they're hyper-focused on worst case scenarios, which is a tendency for them. Remind them of your commitment to them and this one's really important. This one comes out of personal experience as well, because this is the type I identify with. Be impeccable about keeping your word to them. So if it's not possible to keep your word because something has changed in the environment, if you said we had plans tonight, but something changed, keep them in the loop. They don't like to be blindsided. Be intentional about helping them listen to and trust their own inner guidance. And this will be a valuable and lifelong skill that they'll carry into adulthood. The next one is, and the last one we're talking about tonight, is the adventurer style. And this is going to correlate with type 7 on the Enneagram. These kids are usually energetic, optimistic, and they tend toward the happier end of emotions, and they really want to stay there. They are really always up for a good time or the next thing. They're usually well-liked and have lots of friends. They don't like to be limited, like in options, like they want all the options. They want the array of options, and they don't like to be kind of tied down. So sitting still in school for long periods of time can be really torturous for their busy minds and bodies. Adventurers have a special aversion to staying with hard feelings or experiencing grief or other emotions on the sad end of the emotional spectrum. That's going to be much more comfortable for the individualist that we talked about earlier. The type 4 on the Enneagram is much more comfortable with those emotions, but the 7's needs to be more in the happy space. So they compensate for like any sadness that might be creeping in by seeking out the next fun thing to do and distracting their mind from the uncomfortable processing that would bring. So often their enthusiasm for life has them moving quickly from one thing to another, as they like to experience lots of life's offerings in all of its glorious array. Think of like feasting on the smorgasbord of life. And they're primarily motivated by the need to maintain freedom and engage joy, to pursue fun, to keep themselves excited and occupied, and to avoid and discharge pain at all costs. They have a very forward-moving energy, almost as if the next moment will contain everything that the current one lacks. So they're kind of forward-seeking. Parenting these adventurous, curious kids means helping them fully process and experience life's darker emotions and disappointments and devastations, like helping them realize they actually have the resources and the support needed to do so. Help them to practice moderation and learn that more is not necessarily better. Allow them to move their bodies and burn off excess energy in productive ways. And as they grow, continue to help them realize that contentment and adventure live inside them and are not outside themselves somewhere that they have to constantly seek after. And that will help lead to personal fulfillment. So that was a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. Would anybody appreciate a 5-minute break? I just wanted to pop that in here to see if you guys need a quick second. No, keep going. Okay. It's like in college when you're like, no, keep going. Maybe we'll get out early.
I do have a question though.
Yeah, love it.
So I forget the author's name. Engle?
Yes.
Okay. What age range is she talking about? And when does the kid's style transition into the more traditional Enneagram numbers that we know? Clearly there's a lot of overlap, but is this like a 18 and under sort of thing, or 13 and under? Like what's her sweet spot age range that she's really identifying?
Yeah, that seems like a basic question. I would know, and I've read her whole book, but I don't remember her naming a number. We are going to get into when does it start to transition into, okay, we can talk type now instead of more styles. I'm going to circle back around to that in just a little bit, Josh. And then after that, if I don't answer that question, let me know. I would say her book, having read it, is more for probably the elementary set. The elementary set, as you're starting to see their patterns develop, I think is where she pulls from mainly.
Yeah. And a follow-up question. I have heard that it is wrong to associate numbers for other people. how do we avoid misidentifying our kids?
Still coming up.
Okay.
Yeah. So I feel like what I'm going to talk about is going to address that, Josh. If it doesn't hit it just right, what you're talking about, bring it back up. Okay. All right. Okay. Let me, since, if we're okay to keep going. So we've talked about those 9 styles. I want to kind of bring forward a couple of other ways to start to see personality development in your child and what it can look like. And we're going to, through this process in the next one, answer some of Josh's questions. So hang in there for a bit on that. So before we get into the next realm of looking at personality, I did want to make a few clarifying statements. Number one, if of those 9 styles that we talked about, if you see different ones in your kids, like you're like, I see like 3 of those in my kid, that's okay. We're not typing them or naming types at this point. We're just noticing styles so that we can better understand who they are as individuals, and then adjust our parenting styles to meet them right where they are. In fact, number 2 point is it's not wise to type your child. The Enneagram is personal work and an inside job. They're going to figure out their own type if they choose to engage this tool in their own time. The best use of your energies in the Enneagram world as it relates to parenting is to do your own work around it. So use the gifts of self-observation and self-inquiry to determine your own type. Reaching these insights around your own personality styles will be a much more useful gift to you at this stage than even knowing your kid's type, if that were possible, which it's just not wise because their personalities just aren't developed fully yet. I'm going to come right back to that in a second. So instead of noticing or wanting to type your child, notice patterns. So these are going to include things like intelligence centers and learning styles, introvert, extrovert, love language, birth order plays a part, and honor those preferences and ways of showing up in the world. By noticing these unique styles in your child, then you can adapt your parenting style to meet their needs. Remembering this point, fairness doesn't mean that everyone gets the same thing. It doesn't mean that you parent all your kids the same. Fairness means that each child gets what they need to prosper, flourish, and grow. So adapting to where they are at any given stage and to what they're presenting as needing. So be open to your child's expressions in their unique personhood. Notice and name, here's one too. And this again came out of my own parenting journey. Notice and name when they have a way of being in the world that you have a tendency to want to change, but you wouldn't want them to be so desperately introverted or whatever it is. Be honest and own up to when your approach to parenting is really more about you than it is them. And this can show up, of course, in several ways. It can be parenting out of fear, and I can name the ways that I parented out of fear. Maybe overcompensating for your own parents' mistakes and trying to right that wrong in the way that you parent. That's not a bad thing to adjust parenting. But when we overcompensate and now the pendulum swings all the way to the other side and we lose balance is what to look for there. Living vicariously through your child. This is a conversation Josh and I have had as well, like wanting them to have every opportunity you didn't have. So pushing them into a sport they don't want to do, when maybe their thing is the stage, not the field, or things like that. Just being aware of when your parenting becomes more about your own unfinished work than it is about who they are as little people. And then finally, this one's really important. And we're going to circle back to it in a later point, but harboring biases about what makes a good personality versus a bad one. So just being aware of when you bring those things to the table, because they're going to affect your ability to parent as well as you can as well. And then finally, this is important. No type or style that we discussed is better or worse than another, even if it drives us personally crazy, because we all have those personalities that drive us crazy, or those people that walk in the room and you're just averse to them because of their presentation for whatever reason. Each one of the of the types and the styles is part of the human experience. And I think it's important to point out here, we have all 9. We just pull more heavily from one, more consistently. Like one of them is our home base. But as humans, we have access to all the types, and we at times may display all of them at different times. Also, each has its own superpowers and weaknesses. They all have strengths and those things that cause us challenges. So let's widen the scope a bit from the specific 9 personality styles to some bigger patterns that we can also notice in our kids, because, this is the way that we can see personality developing if we aren't focused yet on what their type is. So first, those intelligence centers we talked about earlier. This is one of the triads in the Enneagram. There are several, and it's how we grouped each of the styles when we first talked about them. So that body or gut center, which was containing types 8, 9, and 1. Individuals in this center take life in through their instincts, from the gut, and they generally respond based on what their instinct is telling them to do. And they're the ones that deal most closely with anger. The heart or feeling center contains types 2, 3, and 4. And those individuals start processing information with their feelings, and they generally respond based on what their feelings are telling them to do. They connect with ideas and experiences emotionally, and they're going to deal primarily with shame and image. And then thirdly, the head or thinking center, these are types 5, 6, and 7. They take in life with their thinking processes, with their head, and they generally respond based on what their minds are telling them to do. And here, fear would be a core piece that they're dealing with regularly. So another way of viewing these styles would be what the Enneagram teachings call stances. And in order to get what we need and want, there are 3 basic stances. So here's another triad. So in understanding your child's approach, consider which of these is more likely to be the way they get their needs met. The first one is the aggressive stance. This is types 3, 7, and 8. And they go after what they need or want. They make things happen. They typically have a forward-moving energy, and they take what they require. They go after it. And they may put feelings aside in service of getting things done. The next one is the dependent stance, types 6, 1, and 2. And the dependent stance people typically rely on others to get needs met. They're going to be more likely to network, check in with others, and or maybe create a team of advisors and co-conspirators. And they often have trouble making decisions without kind of taking in the input from others. They may have like a panel of trusted advisors that they're going to seek first. So their dependent stance. And then finally, the withdrawing stance, types 9, 4, and 5. When they're faced with a decision or challenge, they're going to pull away. They're going to go within. They will want to sit with themselves to figure it out. And they will plan things out before coming to a conclusion. They may be up in their head, they may be in their feelings, but they're going to withdraw to figure out what their next step is. So in all these ways, whether you're talking about Enneagram styles or intelligence centers or stances, the key here that we're going for is balance. We want to notice first, and then challenge, and then bring balance out of these rote patterns of our personality structure. So whatever we overutilize, we want, and whatever we underutilize, we want to bring a bit more into balance. So for example, type 5 often undervalues their feelings. Like they just don't have time for feelings or room for feelings. And they overuse their heady analytical powers. So their part of their work would be to engage their feelings and see what that space, like that intelligence center, is telling them, and help to round out those patterns. Getting there, of course, requires curiosity and self-observation, and then self-acceptance and patience. I have a quote that I'm going to bring out from the author we've talked about before, Elizabeth Wagle, and I was actually going to use this on the night we did Instagram Live, but we didn't get to it. So I saved it for tonight. I'm going to close with this. Heather, I saw a question pop up, so I'm going to come back to that. And then we're going to also open it up a bit for some time to hear from all of you and take your questions or comments. So Elizabeth Weigel says, the purpose of using the Enneagram with children is to help us experience children's essential selves or spirits by expanding our awareness of possible types and traits. We learn to be more accepting of styles different from our own, and we learn to constantly remind ourselves that children are far more than all the categories we place them in, including the Enneagram. So I'm going to, in a little bit, I'm going to put some resources in the chat. Her book is on that list, and I'll be sharing that with you guys in just a little bit. So Heather, why doesn't the stance match the triad group? Super. Yeah, so it doesn't. And that's, there are different triads that show up in the Enneagram. The stance, those groupings of stances do match a different triad, which are, each of the types is oriented toward time a certain way. We're either future oriented, present oriented, or past oriented, and that matches up with the stances, but not with the intelligence centers. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Can you say what the triad is for future? And I'm just interested. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's going to match with, if anybody was taking notes, it's going to match with the stances. So 3s, 7s, and 8s are future oriented. Like they're like, what can I get at? What's up next? Like get on to the next thing. They're often like, they're driven. So they're going to be thinking about what the next thing is and coming up. 6s, 1s, and 2s are in the present. They're dealing with whatever's going on right now. And that's coming out of that space of like, that's whatever. So it shows up differently for each of them, but it's dealing with what's happening right now. And then 9s, 4s, and 5s kind of are looking back, like they're either longing for the past or they, that just is, it carries less anxiety to think about the past maybe. So they're going to be past oriented.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? I didn't get through the chat, so somebody let me know if there's a question in there that got embedded. Josh, I know I haven't answered yours because I didn't get all the way to the end of my stuff, so hang tight a little bit longer.
I think you did. It was like the second sentence after I asked my question, you said, we shouldn't type our kids. I was like, oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I
have a little more on that if time would allow. Okay. But I want to leave ample time for questions or conversations. So I definitely want to hear from you guys if there's anything to add or questions.
I have a question with like, I don't know, maybe this is just like I haven't typed our kids, but Michael and I, whenever we read about a 6 or a 7, we're like, oh yeah, Lucy Molly, it like, 90% of it fits. However, I do think like it's a personal journey. And as I talked to you before, my personal journey with the Enneagram was like, oh, I hate this type. And then I'm like, wait, I am this type, so it's like, it's a very like, I don't know, very personal journey. So I totally agree with you there. But I'm wondering as a parent, if it's more effective or like a wiser position to like, instead of being like, oh, my kid has this style, my child has this style of a 4 or something like that, to just, as you said, think about your own strengths and weaknesses in your own type, so that we don't typecast, pun intended, our kids, into that one role. So yeah, like I'm wondering if like maybe going deeper into like our own journey is more important than, thinking about how to parent a 6 or parent an 8 or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. That is one of my biggest takeaways is like the best thing you can do in your parenting journey, whether you use the Enneagram or not, is to do your own work around healing your own past traumas, childhood wounds, adapting those things that we talked about earlier, that we pick those ways of adaptation that we picked up in childhood to make our way in this world and to figure out who we are, but how we can also survive in our family of origin or in our school or wherever we had challenges. So there's work for all of us to do around that. And that work really starts with a process of self-observation. It requires engaging curiosity and avoiding judgment, because it's not for the purpose of judging myself for how I handled it, judging my parents for how I was raised. We're going to set that aside because it's not helpful for this exercise. But then Helen Palmer, early Enneagram teacher, in fact, first one to publish information on the Enneagram. And once she published, cat was out of the bag, and it became more widely known. She also, incidentally, was the founder of the program that I'm studying under. But Helen Palmer talks extensively about the inner observer, just kind of stepping back and asking yourself, why do I do what I do? Why am I this way? What motivates my behavior? And engaging self-inquiry around these topics. And then, importantly, noticing reactivity. What really boils my bones? What makes me so furious instantly? What gets under my skin? Who in my life really irritates me the second they walk in the room? There's information there, that reactivity tells us something. So that's just a really great starting point. Even if you don't know your Enneagram type or aren't interested in learning your Enneagram type, those are really great places to start a journey of self-exploration. That is number one to parenting out of a place of more healthier, wholehearted you, and not staying in those patterns of trauma and rote patterns that we all start life with. Thanks, Heather. Anybody else? Anything else?
This might be too personal of a question, and feel free to say, oh my goodness, what are you doing? Do you feel like if you had studied the Enneagram before, Novi is a 9. I've decided. What am I saying? Oh, do you feel like if you had studied the Enneagram before you had kids, would that have changed the way you did anything, or?
For sure. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
So,
or how would you use that information?
I would say those types that represent my kids. So they're 19 and 21 now. They know the Enneagram. We've talked about it. They've self-identified. My oldest, my 21-year-old, is the 5th of the 5s. That was not a hard one, and he self-identifies as a 5. Now, I'm gonna come right back to him. My younger one is between 7 and 9. He's still figuring it out. We see traits of both. And this is what I mean, when I say, Josh, I didn't answer your question, because I have a few more comments, things like, who here is the same person they were at 21 years old? We're just not. So it's okay if my 19-year-old's I don't know, maybe I'm a 7, maybe, right? Who knows? We'll still, you're still in development. You don't even have your frontal lobe yet. Just give it a few years. You're fine. My 21-year-old, though, interestingly, if I had known the Enneagram when they were little, yes, it would have changed a lot. But he didn't look like the 5th of the 5s when he was 5. He didn't. He was more social. His personality really cemented and changed. We would all say that. He says it too, around middle school, when puberty hit. There were some, he also had a thyroid thing, which delayed some of his growth and some of his development. So middle school, really, right? I mean, it's a wonder anybody makes it out, I swear. He really did a lot of changing. So what I knew when he was little is he liked to be alone. We moved into this new house and he wanted his own room after he had shared it for his whole life with his brother. And all of a sudden he's like, I want my own room. Okay. So we did that. But I would have known better to honor the differences. I still thought back then that there was a formula. And if I just do my part, then I'm going to get this output with my kids. And those formulas are a damn lie, because kids are kids and they have wills, and they're going to grow up and they're going to be like, not anymore. I don't want to do this anymore the way we've done it our whole lives. Or or maybe they will, like, that's just it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but they're their own little people. And then they move, like, then they gain independence. And now they drive away at 16 in this car, and they begin to make their own choices. And mom's not right there to say, okay, go here and then go here and then come home. Like, and as they gain that independence, boy, their personality really flourishes, because now they get to make choices. So, Tessa, I don't feel like that was very specific. What would I have changed? If I think of something more specific, I'll share it. But
I mean, it's sort of an impossible question.
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, but I was just
curious.
I
will say it's been a true joy getting to see my kids grow up and become who they are, regardless of what I did or didn't do. And we can have real conversations about that now. Like, we've talked about things I would do differently. Specifically, a lot of times that conversation focuses around religious themes, because that was the place that I hyper fixated and parented out of. A lot of fear there. So we've had a lot of real good conversations around that, but that's a topic for a different time.
Christi, would you say, like, you've said early on, and I know this is a discussion, but like you said early on, that people have landed on Enneagram numbers being nature, not nurture. But then you've also said that there are some big shifts that happen, for your oldest around puberty or around certain life events or what have you. So what do they say about that? Like, oh, the 5 was always in there. It was just latent and it hadn't really arrived yet. I mean, because to me, it just seems like there were some things that happened that sort of altered the path. And I don't mean that in a negative or pejorative way. I just mean life happened and he became who he is. I could even look back on my life, and I don't know if this is true, but in my head, it's like I was a totally different person in high school than I am now. And I don't mean like, I mean like personality wise, because circumstances were different, and then that something happened and I just took a hard right. So how do they bring all those factors together and still hold that these numbers are embedded early on?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And one I've wrestled with too, because in a lot of Enneagram literature, you're going to read things about a childhood wound. And there's one for each of the types, and basically like a common experience these kids have really had. And I didn't really relate at first with the childhood wound described as my type. Later, I could begin to understand some correlations. But my question was, if there's a childhood wound and out of that we are our type, then we're not born with it. We got it when we got the childhood wound. So I questioned that as well, Josh. And I hope that this is getting at what you're asking. How I came to understand it is, over time, I came to understand it like this. I experienced the world, like, believing that I was born a 6. I experienced the world through the lens of being a 6. So I could have, when I first started studying the Enneagram, I really thought I was a 9, because I was that don't rock the boat kid. I didn't like conflict, like super conflict averse. And that was my role in the family. Like, I was the one who was the easy kid. I didn't rock the boat, and at school too. Later, I thought I was a 2 because I, super helpful, super the teacher's helper, anything I could do for others. But I later realized that underneath all of that is security for me. If I'm helpful to you, then you won't hurt me, is the message. As a 9, if I don't rock the boat, I won't get into dangerous waters, so I I think if I was a 9 child, then my motivation there would be to avoid conflict at all costs and maintain peace. It wasn't about peace for me. It was about security for me, to be safe. It looked like peace and it looked like helping. And in other situations, it looked like being a perfectionist. But I wasn't a perfectionist because I was a 1. I was perfectionistic because by doing so, you wouldn't be able to attack me. My security would remain in place. So it's all about our core motivations. Does that make sense? Okay.
I was talking to a friend of mine about that today because I've taken this test before, and one of the numbers that shows up really high for me is a 5, but I don't relate to that at all. But the way that I grew up with like scarcity and like living in poverty, like there is something to that for when I was a kid. So like my girlfriend was like, well, yeah, that's what you were surviving in, but like your personality was actually a 7, which I relate to also. So I wonder if it's something to do with that too. You know, like when you feel like your types change a lot, has something to do with what your situations were like what
yeah, for sure. For sure. And let me touch on this because it speaks back to Josh's question. But like, so for example, if you have a kid who grew up impoverished and maybe there was scarcity around food insecurity, or they didn't have proper clothing or what other kids had. If you're a 7 child, you're going to create Neverland and you're going to create a fantasy world in which everything is good and you get to escape that difficult reality. If you're a 6 child, you might be super fearful about where your next meal is coming from. So see, it's the same circumstance. It's just how you personally filter it based on that type that I believe. Again, that's a working theory. There's lots of debate around it. And I'm not going to plant my flag firmly in any one camp, but I do think if you're born into the world with your type, then you're going to filter those experiences through that type. But it could, you could certainly come out in several ways based on those scenarios. So, Melissa, another avenue, like for you, and if anyone's still wrestling with their type, understanding subtypes is a really great next place to go because different types, there's a counter type for each one. And so there are 3 subtypes for every type. One of them is a counter type. So it can look a little bit different than the main type structure. So subtypes can often bring clarity when the main types don't. Marnie, that's great. That does sound like a great 5. I love that anecdote. Is there anything else?
Josh, I have another question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Super quick. Is that a Beecher's Chestnuts book, Josh, that you put? Yeah, it's the best. It's the Bible on subtypes, but it's a textbook. It's like, it took me forever to get through it. And it was a labor of love. And I loved it because this is my subject. But man, like that's a deep dive. It's a great book. Heather?
Cool. Sorry, I'm looking at the book description. So you said early on that the types are unconscious motivations or they show us how we act in times of stress and calm. And one thing I've always been confused with the Enneagram is that, like, I'm a 1. And so in times of stress, I act more as a 4. And in times of calm, I act more as a 7. So then what is like specific to type 1? like where does the stress and the calm lie in type 1 if really we're just like outsourcing to like 4 and 7 in times of stress and calm? And again, I'm being very philosophical and analytical about this because that's where my brain goes, but wondering how you kind of like, what's the natural state of like a healthy 1? Is a healthy 1 a 7 because it's in calm? Or I just wonder if you can talk about that. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so Enneagram resources kind of differ on how they describe this. My early readings would have said 7's your security number, 4's your stress number, and that's where you go in stress or security. It's not quite like that. And teachers are now presenting that differently. The fact is, each of the types has lines to other types, and you can use those as resource points. Also, your wings. So you have 2 wings, and you have a resource type, and you have like that stress type is old language sort of, but you have 4 other numbers that you relate to aside from your main type. Heather's talking about like this, they're called stress and security, or like resource points. And so Heather, the fact is you can pull from you can intentionally pull from the higher side of both of those types. So you can pull from the high sides of 4 too. Like as a 1 going to 4, you can become in tune with your feelings and add them to the analytical data that you're processing, and add them to, like, especially your gut motivation, which tells you what's right and wrong. You can also engage like being driven by something different than like that critical inner voice in your head. You have them both as resource points. So a healthy 1 looks like understanding that there's more than one right way. Other people can offer a perspective that can be helpful and useful too, even if it differs from yours. And they're also more balanced in their approach as far as like integrating all 3 head, heart, body centers, just like we all are. And they kind of put down the to-do, like the demanding to-do list or the demanding standards around right and wrong. And they engage like that. So that 7 side comes in, and they engage a little more freedom around that. And like, it's not the demanding thing on their shoulder. Like they can relax and lean into a little more laity, if that makes sense. I know as a 1, you've experienced that, right? Like 1s on vacation are usually super relaxed because they've stepped away from work and the to-do list, and they're now like in a different space. So sorry, that's off the top of my head.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm going to drop a couple resources in the chat as well. I've got some books here. I don't make any money off of all this stuff. Podcasts and websites.
We will probably take whatever you get, Christi, and then make that available on our Instagram page and Facebook so that it can all be in one spot for you all in the next couple of days. But by all means, share away with whatever you got.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments? All right. Well, I'm going to cut you guys loose then. I'm so grateful for all of you for being here and for your fellow journeying with me, and for your time, attention, and commentary. Appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thanks
so much
for lending your expertise. It's nice to, I don't know, I find this stuff really interesting, and it's cool to have someone in our midst that is an expert on it.
Thanks, Tessa.
We will make this recording available as well. So if you found it helpful, then share it with your friends and let them soak in all of the beautiful wisdom from Christi so that we can become more self-aware and become more in touch with our kids too. So thank you, Christi. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.